Good afternoon or good morning for some of us, and welcome to today's structured conversation. My name is Carrie Klima, and I will serve as your moderator today. On behalf of the SAL Professional Development Committee, I thank you for participating in today's structured conversation, and an extra thank you to our speakers here today. A few logistics before we get started. As you all are aware, we are using the Zoom platform for this call. And so you all are muted upon entry, and later when we have a chance for questions and dialogue with our presenters, we will allow you and encourage you to unmute and unvideo block yourself so that you can engage in a conversation with some questions. And also, you may chat in questions throughout, and I'll do some monitoring of that chat window to help condense any questions you may have, and we can engage in a discussion about midway through the conversation as well as at the end. And so let's go ahead and get started. So what our title for today's session is What's Really Going On with Retention, a Guide for Student Affairs Practitioners. And we have three presenters who presented this previously, and we're fortunate enough today to have two of them with us to provide this presentation. We have Charlene Herreid, Tom Miller, and Valeria Garcia. I'm sorry, I understand. I get Klima all the time instead of Klima. And just a few minutes, we want to spend time providing some context of our presenters. And so Valeria Garcia stands among many talented professionals who provide leadership for a rapidly growing and dynamic institution of higher ed, the University of South Florida. And for the past decade, Dr. Garcia has been a dedicated leader in the USF System Office of Decision Support, with the majority of her time spent in senior leadership role overseeing the fast-paced office, which provides information to support decision-making and solutions to promote the university's strategic plan. Throughout her nearly 20-year tenure in higher ed, Dr. Garcia has built a reputation for genuinely, eagerly, and responsibly supporting the institution's strategic direction and promoting advanced efforts around student and faculty success through the use of data, information, analytics, collegiality, and ethical decision-making. Valeria holds a doctoral degree in leadership and education administration with an emphasis in policy, a master's in public administration and policy, and a bachelor's in special education. And Charlene is the Director of Student Affairs Research and Assessment at New York University. She received her bachelor's, master's, and PhD degrees in psychology from the University of Miami at Coral Gables, Florida, with a specialty in cognitive social psychology. After 20 years experience in institutional research, including almost 10 as the Director of Institutional Research at St. Leo University, one of the largest Catholic universities in the country, she moved to Student Affairs in 2008 as the first Director of Student Affairs Assessment at the University of South Florida in Tampa. She is reprising that role at NYU, and her professional interests include student affairs assessment, predictive analytics, and better ways to connect student affairs practitioners and IR professionals to improve student success. I think both of their bios really represent what we strive to be as leaders in our organization, and so we thank them for providing this presentation. And really, as we move forward, we do find that it's important to remind you all and let you know about the student learning outcomes. So as a result of the structured conversations, participants will be able to apply a guide to evaluating retention and graduation patterns at their respective institutions, list examples of data success and challenges in the context of higher education, identify several ways to initiate or elevate data sharing and in a transparent model, partnering with IR and other data units, and describe the level at which their organization makes student success information available and accessible to student affairs professionals. So we have an eager agenda, and I'm really excited to hear more. And so at this time, we'll turn it over to you all to begin our presentation.
It would help if I was unmuted. Let me start over. Thank you, Carrie. And thank you for everybody who was able to join us today to engage in a conversation with us. I was just saying that on behalf of, I'm sure, Charlene, who jump in when you can, Charlene, and Dr. Tom Miller, who couldn't be with us today. But we have really appreciated working together across the different fields and hope that you can learn a little bit about what we've done. You heard from a little bit about us and why we're presenting together. I think you heard the thread in there. Charlene left us, left Florida and on to bigger and better things now, but different opportunities, and we miss her tremendously. But in the course of the time that we were able to work together and spend time together, we did a lot of things good at USF, the University of South Florida, but also broadly for our respective professional areas in how we elevate data and analytics. So that's what brought us here together. And Charlene, did you want to add just a tad bit about that?
I think that covers it all, Valeria.
Wonderful. So we're going to move on because there's a lot for us to cover, as Carrie mentioned, and we do hope that we can have a conversation. We'll have some pause times in the middle of our conversation today also to ask some questions and hopefully provide some additional information.
Okay, thanks very much, Valeria. And I'd like to get started by saying that in student affairs these days, there's a focus on data-driven planning and decision-making, and we're increasingly being called on to conduct and demonstrate data-driven planning, data-driven decision-making, and show our impact on retention, graduation rates, first career outcomes. But it seems like sometimes it's forgotten that to be able to give data, you sometimes need to get data. And sometimes, I don't know about you, but sometimes I feel like the left-hand picture shows what people want from us, a smooth, beautiful model that shows our impact on all these different outcomes and how everything works. But sometimes what I feel like we get is what's on the right-hand side, sort of leftover bits and pieces of reports that might have one or two pieces or statistics about retention from one year or another, and maybe a little bit about 6-year retention and maybe a little bit about first-year retention, but not the whole picture, not all the tools and materials that we need in order to do our work in student affairs. So one of the issues that comes up is that now that we're moving to student success models, a lot of us are being told that some of our outcomes, our success is going to be based on things like our first-year retention rate, 4-year graduation rates, and 6-year graduation rates. And we need to know what these things are, what they were and what they have been in order to have an impact on those things. But in many institutions, that information is still not easily available. And that's kind of strange because all of those things are public record. First-year retention and 6-year graduation rates are recorded by IPEDS, the Integrated Post-Secondary Education Data System that collects data for the federal government. 4-year retention rates are available. Well, really, they can be calculated from data that's on the Common Data Set, which gives out kind of similar information about universities online. So there really isn't any reason to hide this information on our campuses or to be obscure about it because the public can see a lot of it already. And certainly all of our competitors go and find out what our first-year retention and 6-year graduation rates and 4-year graduation rates anytime that they want. And I don't think it is so much that people are hiding things, but there is a reluctance at many colleges and universities to share these things. And I think some of that is just due to the culture that we've had in the past. Next screen. Valeria? Yeah, please, thanks. And then sometimes there's fear that when people start using data, we're going to find mistakes or errors. Nobody wants to look bad. But the truth is, once we start using the data more effectively, if we find problems in it, we can report it back to the people that secure our data, and they can fix those things, and then they're right from now on. So it's not really a rational or a conscious thing, but just kind of a fear of doing something new. So at the institutional level, it's still maybe difficult for staff to get the data you need about retention and graduation and first career outcomes to design interventions for student performance. Sometimes the retention and graduation rates are available on an annual basis, but they're not put into any kind of comprehensive database. So you might have to go to dashboards from many years to pull together enough information to see trends and what's going on. A lot of the retention data may not be available or may not be shared beyond the first year or the 6th year first-year retention and sixth-year graduation rates, but that doesn't tell you where problems might be starting in between those two times and when you might be able to fix it. And certainly, if the data aren't broken down, you can't tell if different groups are behaving the same way or differently, if they need the same interventions, or if different groups of people would benefit from different kinds of interventions. So you, as a student affairs professional, may find out you don't have these things available, and you go to your institutional research office or whatever office is in charge of the data or data warehouse and ask for this information, and you may be told, just go look at the student database. That's a problem because a lot of times there's a student database or a student data warehouse that exists, but it may not be easy to get into the database and use it yourself. A lot of times there's redundancy of fields, so that there might be 3 fields in the database labeled international students. One might be used for admissions for whatever purposes they have. Another might be used by study abroad. Another might be used by another organization for a different purpose, and you don't know which one is the quote-unquote correct field to use if you just want to know who is an international student. Lots of times too, the student databases or warehouses are transactional or operational versus benchmark. So if you go in today and you ask how many students are enrolled at our university, you'll get one number. If you go in 15 minutes later and ask the same question, you're going to get a different number. So anyone going in and pulling off different different time stamps of the data, they're going to get different answers to any questions that they ask. And that can cause a lot of confusion. If different offices and units are going through and pulling their own data from these warehouses and they're all different, eventually what you get into is a situation where everyone doubts everyone else's data and no one believes any data from anyone anymore. So a question for us is, how can we organize all of the data around persistence, retention, and graduation that are floating around the institution so that we can use that to devise interventions in our student affairs units to help students succeed? So what I would like you to do is dust off some simple basic concepts from your research and assessment coursework and use those to move forward. And what I'm specifically referring to are what I'm calling levels of information. Simplest are frequency distributions of data about retention, graduation rates, and so forth. We can also benefit from looking at cross tabulations, where we cross one or more variables with those outcomes. Layered cross tabs, multiple crosses. We can also look at multivariate analysis, which looks at the effect of many different variables on retention or graduation, and then move to a different level, which we're calling horizontal drill downs, to make comparisons to see what seems to be affecting retention between different groups. So just real quickly for review, frequency distributions tell you things like, what's the big picture? It's good for counting things. They're good for showing what's happening over time. They're good for showing you trends. And questions that frequency distributions are good at answering are, what are historic trends in retention and graduation rates at our institution? When have changes occurred? What are the turning points? And are current trends likely to continue into the future? So to prepare good frequency distributions, you have to have data that are reliable and will not be contested, so that you don't get into, well, there were really, the retention rate for the first year was 22%. No, it was 21.7%. You can't have that, or it's not going to work. The data need to be provided and updated each year, so you can't have missing years. No longer than a 1-year lag. And if we're using 6-year graduation rates, which are pretty much the standard established by IPEDS, you probably need 2 cycles of data at a minimum to really understand what's going on. Providing data each year but leaving their compilation up to individual offices or persons doesn't work. If there's some kind of Excel protocol, people can go in and calculate their own retention rates, say, but if they want to break it down by, say, men and women over 10 years, they would have to perform 20 different calculations. People just aren't going to do that. That's not going to happen. And so it's not really a helpful way to provide this kind of information to the university at large. first year retention, 4-year and 6-year graduation rates should be made available for everyone. There's no real reason to keep that back because they're public record. Thanks, Larry. Okay, so this is an example of a frequency distribution of retention rates at the University of South Florida over a period of 17 years. And you can say it's very clear. It has the percentages for each year obviously available. And you can look at it and see where things were steady, things went up, things changed. And it gives you a helpful overview of everything that's going on. So USF started at about a little over 80% first-year retention, which was really quite good for an institution of its kind. But we weren't really content with that. And so you can see when you go over to about 2006, 2007, all of a sudden there's a jump, which corresponds to one of the first retention initiatives they had. Then you can see if you go over to 2010 and 2011, it kind of dipped, but then it went back up again, which also corresponded to our first efforts to create an Office of Student Success and have someone in charge of that function. And then you can see finally, by the end of the time period, USF was able to reach the level which it wanted, which was 90% or more for first year retention. And this kind of gives you some perspective too, because when we were living through this, for instance, fall 2010, you can see there was a dip and everybody was very concerned, but fortunately because we knew it and we could see it, we were able to do something about that later so that it wasn't a problem after that. Here are 4-year retention rates at USF over a period of 14 years, and you can see that at the beginning of the time period, only 1 out of 5 USF students were completing their 4-year degrees on time. And so that's not very high, but at that time I can tell you that the state was more focused on enrolling people than in finishing people, and so the university naturally had responded to that. When priorities changed and retention and graduation became more important, we put more effort into it, and now 2 out of 3 USF students finish their degrees in 4 years. Almost 2 out of 3. Next. Okay, thanks. Okay, and now 6-year rates. You can see the frequency distribution shows us that at the beginning of the time period, fewer than half of USF students were finishing their degrees in 6 years. And over time, you can see how we worked our way up to now, which is almost 3 out of 4 USF students are finishing their degrees in 6 years. So frequency distributions are a great way to collect a lot of data and present it very quickly and easily. And you may have these things, but do you have the 2nd and 3rd year retention and graduation rates and 4th year and 5th year? Because that raises the question, what's happening in between the 1st year and the 4-year and 6-year graduation points? So that brings up the 2nd level, which is cross tabulations. And as you know, this is breaking down one variable by levels of another. And you end up with, say you have 2 variables with 2 levels, you'll have a 2x2 table, 2 variables, one with 2 levels and one with 4, a 2x4 table, and so on. And IPES itself asks for 1st year retention rates by sex and race ethnicity, and also 6-year graduation rates by sex and race ethnicity. But there are a lot of different variables that can be examined through cross tabulations. Sex and retention, major race ethnic categories. You could look at Pell Grant recipients versus non-recipients, their retention and graduation rates. First generation or non-first, compare different schools and colleges, whether people are active in clubs or organizations or not. All of these things can be looked at with crosstabs. Questions that can be addressed with crosstabs very nicely. Are there notable differences among important groups of students in retention and graduation rates? Which groups are doing well? Which groups may need help? When do differences in performance begin to occur? And so we worked with this at the University of South Florida. One of the things that we pulled out based on some reports that institutional research were doing each year was to look at the retention rates of men and women over time. And this is what you're seeing now is 1st year retention rates broken down by men and women. And you can see that there's not too much difference between men and women, although men were pretty much at a disadvantage until just recently, and you can see that the retention rate, first-year retention rate of men is actually higher, slightly higher than women now. Those numbers should be reversed, but there's not too much going on here in terms of differences between them. But when we looked at the cross-tabulation comparing men and women at the 4-year graduation rate, we found a big difference, and this was a surprise to us. I mean, we knew, generally speaking, that the women were doing better than men, but we had no idea that the difference was this large. And what's really interesting about this information is that in spite of the fact that everyone went up, men and women went up, they both increased substantially in their 4-year graduation rates, the difference between men and women has remained, and as a matter of fact, it's a little bigger now than it was before. And so that raised a lot of questions in our mind about what could be causing that. And we found the same thing with the 6-year graduation rates, that there was about a 10 percentage point discrepancy between 6-year graduation rates between men and women that had continued over the entire 12-year period that we have here. Everybody got better, but it didn't change the difference between the two groups. And that's been real interesting to us. And that's one thing that people have followed up in trying to understand. So the next level are layered cross-tabulations, and that's a cross-tabulation conducted with 3 or more variables. So in this case, some examples would be first-year retention rate by gender and race ethnic, 4-year graduation rates by gender and college, or you could look at 6-year graduation rates by race, ethnicity, and Pell Grant receipt. Now, I'm not showing you a picture of that because they tend to look like spaghetti. But if you're interested in the different groups, then you can track out performance of particular groups over time. But there are some good questions that layered crosstabs can address. Are there particular groups that are underperforming or overperforming compared to others? When do these changes begin or start? And does the pattern over time suggest any action that might be taken to offer groups special help? Now, one issue is that crosstabs can be complicated. Layered crosstabs can be very complicated. If you add more variables, relationships may change, and it's often pretty difficult to really figure out what's going on. So if you're going to be doing layered crosstabs, you probably want to do this only with variables that are extreme interest to you, because it can take a lot of effort to understand what's going on, and it's not worth it to look at everything by everything here. Now, now we come to level 4, which is the level of multivariate modeling. And this is what you really need to use when you move past having 3 or more variables that you're trying to use to predict an outcome. The human mind just can't really understand all of that going on in just tabulations and pictures. So you really need statistical help here. Some issues with using multivariate modeling are that you do need large data sets, and the data sets have to be prepared especially for the analysis. But as I mentioned, it does resolve the problem of human cognitive limitations with multiple predictors. And this is where we get into what's termed predictive analytics. You can use the model to review a relatively large number of variables, and then once you have this model, you can actually apply it to new groups of students coming in to predict what their behavior might be like in the future. Will they be retained? Will they graduate at a certain period of time? And so forth. So so that's all a good thing about multivariate modeling. Any good things about it? Okay, so basically what multivariate modeling or predictive modeling can tell you, does a group of variables predict an outcome? Which of a group of variables can predict an outcome, and which variables are the best predictors of the outcome? So that can be very useful. Models have to be created and tested. There's no guarantee that any variables will predict the outcome of interest, so you're always taking that risk when you're doing this kind of modeling. But some studies that might be undertaken would be to predict first and second year retention for new FTIC students using pre-matriculation and early performance characteristics, predicting first term or first year academic performance for new FTIC students, and predicting 4- and 6-year graduation rates for students who have reached the junior level. Now, as student affairs practitioners, we're probably not going to be doing that in our own offices. But if your institutional research office or another office is doing those sort of things, ask for the results, ask for it to be explained to you so that you can use that in understanding the student population better to conduct interventions. And the final level of data that we have looked at is what we call horizontal drill downs. And this is a change of focus from looking at relationships of student variables with differing retention and graduation rates to contrasting characteristics of different group members who are retained or graduated at different rates. And we're moving then from just documenting the existence and patterns of different retention rates among different groups of students to looking for possible causes of those differences with an eye to actionable improvement. So when we do this, usually what we will do is take snapshots of students at different levels being retained or graduated and contrast them to see if they differ on behavior, actions, or attitudes. And we will explore those differences to determine patterns of association. So there are dozens of possible predictor variables over many time periods. But sometimes when you're doing this, you can move back to simpler levels of analysis, like simple crosstabs of frequency distributions to choose which comparisons to make. So some possible questions you can look at using this level of data. Do pre-matriculation differences exist between the groups, demonstrating different retention and graduation rates? So you might compare retained and non-retained students at the first year on their average GPA, test scores, gender, college on entry, major on entry, looking for differences in those characteristics between the two groups, and then presuming that that is in some way affecting retention. You can also ask, do differences in performance after entry exist between groups demonstrating different retention and graduation rates? Are there different GPAs after a year in college? Are progression rates different? Do they join student organizations at different rates? And various other characteristics to see if that has some potential explanatory power for differences in behavior. So we're at the discussion opportunity, data availability and support. So I will turn it back to you now, Valeria. Thank you.
Sure. And so we just wanted to, normally when we would present this in person, in live view, we would have some parent share type of opportunities, but given the mode today, if those who feel ambitious and want to share what's happening at your institutions, we want to hear back. So on a scale from 1 to 5, where 5 is the highest, how would you rate the level of data maturity at your institution? Some examples are provided there. A few other questions that you can respond to is, do you have data such as those that Charlene went through today at these levels available to you? And if so, who provides you with these data? And what possibly are challenges you are presented with around these data needs? If there are any questions that to anything that has been discussed to date also, we're happy to entertain that at this time before we move forward. Anyone want to share?
Well, and I'd just like to say, while we're waiting for any questions to come in, Valeria, we didn't come to this, big schema all at once. It was over a period of years that we started looking for different kinds of data available about retention, that IR and student affairs began to work together to come up with what kind of information would help us with our interventions. What was your experience of that?
Yeah, agreed. And I think the reason we're even here together, as we mentioned before, was because it wasn't always easy and we didn't have it all figured out. I don't think we have it fully figured out now, but part of what allowed, I think, USF to continue in its trajectory is, one, the availability of data, but also an understanding in the partnerships across units. So from a decision support, which is institutional research or analytics at different institutions, it's us understanding what the needs are, and vice versa, student affairs understanding that there are data available and how we can get a hold of those types of data. So,
well, I think that over the years we were very successful because I think, what was it, the Chronicle of Higher Education cited USF as the most improved large four-year institution in the country for 6-year graduation rates over the past 5 years.
Yeah.
And USF was also able to get the appellation, or whatever it is, of preeminent university
Yes.
in the state of Florida,
Yes.
which was really a fabulous accomplishment.
Great. I think, and I don't know if there are any specific questions, Carrie, should we move forward?
Yeah, I mean, I think there was one comment that was shared in the chat window, and I think it's similar to my institution of thinking through. They shared that the level of data maturity varies greatly even between the departments within student affairs.
Great point, right? And go ahead.
No, I'm good.
No, and I think that's a really important point, and depending on the size of an institution, but sometimes that doesn't even matter as well. It's organization of the organizational structure. Sometimes it's external factors that Charlene mentioned in a previous slide, when some of our University of South Florida rates weren't what we are today. The external discussions, though, we were funded, basically Florida schools were funded based on enrollment. And that's how funding was. Now, today, funding is based on performance-based funding, and many metrics within there are retention, what we call academic progress rate, graduation rate. So a lot of times it's external and internal factors that are going to drive how important or how data are utilized internally, and also who they are shared with. And so that's a really important piece to keep track of. But when you have longitudinal data like this, and you have databases that are structured as such that you can go back, the pendulum tends to swing. And so you're able to go back and revisit what trends were happening at different time periods. And you know, Charlene narrated it, but at various time points in our trajectory, you can tie back policy changes, external legislative changes. So there's different factors that play into also being able to see the data from policy side, but see the data in longitudinal ways and in different ways by subset of student populations that we all serve. So we're going to keep on moving forward, and please, you know, anyone, if you have a question that pops up, please do share that, and we will get to those towards the latter part of the conversation today. Oh, get back here because I'm driving. So using the levels as a guide at USF, I am by no means going to try to pretend I'm Dr. Miller. Tom Miller, for those who don't know, he's been called a legend. I've heard that been said, but he is very much has been a voice of professional and experience within student affairs. It translates over into the institutional research side, at least for me and the colleagues we've worked with because of our work together. But what I wanted to do today was just maybe touch on a few things. Again, the practical side, so using all the levels from a practitioner side, from student affairs that you just heard Charlene walk you through. That's one part of it, but then how you apply at an institution, that's equally a big part of utilizing data and predictive analytics and all the other new frontiers that we're all kind of gearing towards with data. So when we talked about the frequency distributions, and I'm going to skip through some of these because you've seen them already, but it's speaking to how the trajectory for USF anyway, and some of the things that we've done to be able to really look at the data, utilize the data, make it actionable so that we're not referring to quote unquote dead data, which was back in the day what was referred to, and probably still. But looking at what those retention rates, the 4-year graduation rates over time, and the 6-year graduation rates over time. A lot of that really precipitated a student success movement. It was not just something we talked about for a year. It was a coordination of over 100 people for a movement that started many years ago, followed up with the initiation of a vice president and office of student success. We also have had several other organizational changes within that, so student affairs and academic affairs coming together. So again, trying to break down silos so that the silos that were created because organizations were separate were trickling down to students. And so we had at one time what we fondly called our USF shuffle, and different things. Everybody has some variation of that or has seen that. And so I think organizationally how we structure ourselves also helps, and we have seen that in our data because we've made some very deliberate changes. One of the main things I want to focus on for today's conversation is how we've really looked at the gender gap. And we have, it's probably something that it has been there, as we've seen, not as much at the retention rate as you can see here. We enroll and we retain men and women about the same, and historically have, with some variations depending on the year and the cohort. And then really where we're seeing these bigger gaps have been in the four-year. Interestingly, in the 6-year, and I'll start there first, the 6-year rate shows a little bit smaller gap between men and women. And again, looking at our external demands, the big pressure nationally has also been 6-year graduation rate. So the focus has been 6-year graduation rate, and in our state of Florida has been 6-year graduation rate. And so in all honesty, the focus had been 6-year graduation rate. And while we looked at some of the term-to-term type of graduation, the focus wasn't as much that. When we started shifting to our 4-year graduation rate, we had this really big aha in our institution, because we thought that that was much smaller of a gap. And as Charlene mentioned before, the gender gap is very alarming. And so from that, what we've done is taken very actionable next steps. So we're involved in various initiatives, very much focused on on the data and looking at our male student performance, and across all race ethnic groups. Some usually ask if we see that predominantly in underrepresented minorities. We actually don't. In many ways, we're seeing that across all of our ethnic groups as a whole, men as a whole, not necessarily, we're not seeing as big of gaps between our specific race ethnic groups, Hispanic, African American, etc. We've also made it a point from a data to make sure that everything we do internally, all of our reports, we have ability to drill down, so disaggregate to the level of male, female, so gender, race, ethnicity, Pell, first generation status, and we have various other things like honors. And so the ability to drill down, so one of the points that Charlene made earlier about being able to just have access, one, is important, but also understanding the data that we're dealing with is another really critical aspect of it. And so here at USF, we have various efforts such as our care teams. We have student success advocates, and I know from a student success perspective, our institution, Dr. Paul Dosal and Dr. Miller and others have presented quite a bit around the use of various tools like Civitas. We're a subscriber to Civitas for our predictive analytics, but we don't use one tool in particular. We pretty much use everything, both in-house analyses, like Charlene was referencing, but also looking at our bigger tools that we use. So we supplement across the board. So we've really been very engaged on how we use the data and how we hand it off in a very timely manner to those in the front lines, if you will. Those in student affairs, those in undergrad studies, those in our colleges, because everybody plays a role in how we're elevating and making sure our students are successful at USF. I did 6-year. I'll back up for 1 second. And Charlene, did you have anything additional to add during your time here before we leave Tom's slides and I move on?
No, just how it was always fascinating to me that, you know, it was interesting because we were doing so much better and everyone has done better, but why this gap is maintaining is really interesting. And, you know, just from a professional point of view, it's a fascinating thing going on.
And it does take, it takes more than just one area, both institutional research or decision support or student affairs, because this gap is not just a USF specific thing, it's national. We're actually engaged in an APLU powered by Publix, some of you may be aware of, and that our subgroup, our cluster is very much focused, our whole group of institutions are looking at the gender gap. So there's a body of literature around that, and I think there are some political kind of ramifications around that in terms of how people see and perceive gender gaps, because usually our conversations are around race and ethnicity in particular, or levels of financial aid or different specific categories having this why. And so getting our heads around a whole population is a much bigger, more complex type of endeavor that really does require much more hands-on from many offices. So in our care team, just as an example, we have people involved in that care team from not only advisors and advocates, but we have people in the housing, in student organizations, in the comptroller's office, student accounts. Everybody who possibly touches a student's life is involved in this kind of care team approach that we have at USF. And so being able to look at these differences and understand these gaps across trend and across time is critically important to utilize these data and hand those off in a very important way to move that forward. So I'm going to move on to parts of my world. So as I'm the AVP for our decision support office and basically house traditional institutional research, some of the regulatory pieces that we have to do, also institutional effectiveness, and that's how Charlene and I came to work together for so many years and in various capacities, in fact. And some of the work for keeping in mind the IR and student affairs collaboration, again, back on the data and the importance of data democratization. What you see in front of you is a borrowed slide around axes of trust, and there's differences in where you land is somewhere in between. So in terms of access, who can be trusted? And trust is an important piece of it because there's a level of responsibility. It's not just making sure somebody can just take the data or that they've taken their FERPA quiz to be able to pass that, but it's an ability to understand that we have a responsibility of data, which are the information for our university to protect our students and to make sure that what we're using the data for are for healthy and important ways to move forward our student success efforts. So either access is either very tightly controlled at your institution or everyone has access to it, and there's arguments for both sides, and there's somewhere in between that you may fall. Individual data literacy. So the arguments often to tightly control things is because people cannot be trusted to interpret data correctly. And there is an onus on institutional research offices or like type of offices within your campuses to make sure that there are data dictionaries available, that there's a process, there's a mechanism at which people can have access to data, understand where data are housed and which data should be used for which purpose. So for example, Charlene mentioned operational data and transactional data. There's a difference between operational data that may come from your student information system and those data which are more benchmark data, which can be used for more comparative year-to-year types of change. But there's a value for operational data that are needed. And so holding that too tightly controlled really defeats the purpose because that's where the action is going to reside. Further organizational decision making. So who is trusted to make decisions based on data? There is a need for an audit and just protecting the institution to have organizational structures around decision making. And so those are all very important pieces to keep in mind. So Charlene had this wonderful idea based on our previous presentations, such as this one, and we kind of cobbled together what we thought was a really interesting way to be able to assess your availability and accessibility of student success data, more specifically for the student affairs professional groups, but I think could apply for other groups as well. And I'm just going to walk you through a very high level, and we're happy to make these the slide deck available and this rubric in particular available. But what this really looks at is 4 different areas for data. Data completeness, data accessibility, data reliability, and timeliness. And the scale goes from poor to very good, and you probably could find yourself in between. And in some cases, you could find yourself high in one area and not so high in another area. And we've included some area here for comments for internal discussion because this is intentionally something that could be taken back to your institutions, to your units, and really just something to be able to self-reflect and really understand where the institution is. And if there are any things in here that you can help move forward or work with different units or different partners to move forward, then these are very important areas to kind of think through. So for data completeness, you're looking for everything from nothing that Charlene mentioned in terms of her levels being available to almost everything being available for a span of time that really allows you to look at trends and really understand gaps in what's happening with your student populations. Accessibility is pretty much what it says. It's not only how or the fact of frequency and how reports are being made available, but I would argue that it's also in the manner, the mode of which they're available. So if they're only available to you because you have to request it, and it's handed off to you in a PDF format, that's not very actionable for you to do much with. But more and more people are moving into using different visualization tools, and how you utilize those tools is going to just elevate their ability to analyze the data. I will caution that we say fondly here at USF that we've moved into sharing Excel files to now sharing dashboards. So there does have to be some type of governance and understanding about how people consume dashboards, how people know which dashboard to go to for which purpose. And so the same way that people may have shared Excel files of different data, pivot tables and those types of things, you kind of can go into that pretty quickly and easily into the dashboard visualization world. And so that's a caution area, not go that way, because that's very important to really explore data in a much more meaningful way, but also just having cautions that it can get very confusing if there are various dashboards around and people not perhaps using the same data sources or the same data definitions. And so all the same quote unquote rules of data governance would apply in whatever mode data are being made available in. Data reliability, pretty straightforward. Trusted sources of data are going to be clean. There are times and places where operational data, straight rough data that are coming straight out of your student information system, and that's perfectly fine. But making sure you balance that with who's using that and which purpose and who it's being presented to, all those are very important. And when you gauge your assessing your levels of data sharing. And then timeliness. The biggest key here is when folks receive the data. If they receive the data too far, when they beyond a point that they can have any effect, that's not going to be a timely report. The most important is to understand and work together to understand what the timelines are, what if there's a drop ad benchmark, or if there's a time frame when financial aid is going to be revoked, or if there's any other changes in terms of the policies around which students abide by, that those are the pieces that we're looking at the data and how they flow through the student life. So the collaboration between IR and student affairs is really expanding, and it's evolving even at USF. We have pretty shared strategies. We have various things outside of what I'm listing here, which is data governance, which is critically important. If you don't have already a data governance program, that's definitely something that you want to ask about. If you haven't heard about data governance or information governance, it can be framed in different ways. That's something that you want to ask about. Does this exist at my institution? If it doesn't, then I would ask those questions, because the ability to have reliable and everything that we talked about in the rubric is going to depend on a structure, a framework by which the data can be managed. Data sharing strategy, again, that ties back into governance. And when I talk about data sharing, I'll give an example. Data sharing at USF wasn't always as collaborative, and I think part of that is because everybody's doing their work. But after a lot of different conversations and meetings, and we tried different ways, because sometimes one way we set up a meeting or it wasn't the right people, or another way was maybe too high level of people and not enough of those who were going to actually do the work. And so testing out different ways collaboration works is okay. And it doesn't mean that you get it wrong the first time, that it's not going to work out. You just have to try a different structure of how that works. So for example, right now we have what's called the Student Success Collaborative. And I chair it, I lead this effort, but it's units from across all of our campuses, because we have multi-campuses. But it's all those folks who are building dashboards that are centrally used. It's all those folks who are sharing information with senior leadership. And we bring this group together on a monthly basis. At first, it was more regularly. And we tackled very concrete items. So if we needed to revisit our transfer cohorts and how those lived in the central data sources, we tackled that. If we needed to rename codes and naming conventions, we tackled that. So very tangible ways to bring people together on shared pain points and shared successes after that. And so that's just one opportunity for data sharing. Transparency of methodology and data sources. This will come with these conversations. The second people have a shared sense of this is my pain point, and I do say that, the more the easier it will be to get down to sharing those methodologies and data sources to ease some of those pain points. And then finally, awareness and accessibility of tools. Critically important because more often than not, a few years ago, it was more, had more people on our campus who just weren't aware of which either that something was available or which tool was available for the need that they had. And we had a lot of data, a lot of tools, and a lot of reports, but until we had all that organized in such a way that folks knew where to go, then we couldn't continue to advance. And so what you don't want to do is, if you don't address the awareness and accessibility of tools in partnership with your IT or IR, or whoever it is who's dealing with data on your campus, then what ends up happening is people just need to do their jobs and they create their own silos and they create their own shadow systems, and that's probably the worst direction you want to go in terms of a data perspective. So I referenced some of these already. The only other additional one I want to just make sure is this developing a culture of use of data for different purposes and for different audiences. And again, just being mindful of the work together and the work that the additional stakeholders that will continue to work with you as the IR student affairs, student success collaboration evolves. And just, I know we're nearing our time, but I wanted to share some examples of some of the products that have come out at USF. The first one that you see off to the left that sits more forward is actually one of our newest ones. And if you looked at the top corner, if you could see that, it actually says ODS and UGS Collaborative Report. This is probably one of the first ones of our collaboration. This is where IR is validating all of the underlying cohorts, all of the underlying data. And then our undergrad studies peers are overlaying the different metrics that they find important for them to look at on a daily basis. So in this case, you're looking at trends from prior year for retention. It's looking at where we are to date. You can drill down by college, race, ethnicity. It's also looking at students with holds. So all the pieces that they found important, they put in here, and we validated all the data behind the scenes so that at the end we had a very stable data report, a dashboard that folks could come to with confidence and get a sense of where we were for our retention rates. The one subsequently behind that is more internal or available for people, but it built in-house, and it drills down to everything possible, but again, makes available all of the data for our metrics that we monitor on a regular basis and at different levels for college, et cetera. The next couple ones are very college specific, so we engage highly with our colleges, not just with our central offices. And these are ways where we have student flows, we have college reviews in which we are looking at the data in different ways. And again, all of these are transparent, they're made available for our college leadership. They are behind single sign-on, but people know where and when to be able to go to these different reports to access them and get a sense of where they are. At that point, it's basically, I refer to like a marathon. I hand off. We've done this one part of it, I hand off the baton, and others are doing their work in different respective areas for student success. And this is just yet one additional example of forecasting and looking at our graduation and retention rates. So I'm going to pause now with a few minutes left to spare. I think just about exactly amount. Carrie, we couldn't have timed that better.
Yes, I think that is perfect timing. And I think really speaking to this end part and how you talked about the ways in which you all collaborate, maybe through committee work, through these joint relationships that you all have developed. One question that came in about halfway through was, how do you help folks with the collaboration and kind of developing that collaboration in a sense so that folks aren't feeling like they own the data? And so how do you bring together folks in a holistic approach?
So I think it's happening in different ways. So our care team is basically looking and really approaching the student from the student perspective, and what do we know about the student and what do we need to do to help the student. So that's kind of one of the collaborative ways. I think the question is probably around the data, underlying data sides. And I think part of it is personality, part of it is just constant conversations because we needed to have those. We've delineated at USF anyway, so my office handles all of the quote-unquote official data. So anything that's going to end up tying back to one of our performance-based funding metrics, our preeminence metrics, whatever the metric is, the data sources need to align. So the second we got out of the office pieces, who needs to do what, we have to understand that and respect that. But we also come down to a structured data set. So as long as there is a core data, so everybody knows that if they're going to do any analysis around graduation rates, they need to be pulling cohorts from this specific table. And then everybody knows that and they're familiar, and then there's no questions. Otherwise, before, many years ago, we would show up and we would have differences in our graduation rates. And sure enough, it was because it was a different cohort that they started with. And so you have different analyses from there. So I think we've kind of been able to just talk through based on understanding what roles and responsibilities are at our institution.
I'd like to add too that, Rome wasn't built in a day here. A lot of it was, trial and error, where we would bring some people together, and like Valeria said, they were at too high a level, or, they just weren't people that could really solve any of the problems. We were also really highly motivated because USF was performing very well, but it wasn't really being reflected in our retention and graduation rates and so forth. And we really felt we were better than that. Plus, which there's a lot of money involved too in state funding, so that always helps everybody focus. But that helped to be very motivated. Our leadership was very motivated to make these improvements. And then some of it was just getting people together and then finding out that there was some policy in the cashier's office that was making people not come back, and if they owed like $100, and that could have been fixed, and then we could count them as retained. So then we invited somebody from the cashier's office, to be in the group, and whatever groups we found were important, we began to be as inclusive as possible and have everybody bring their input, and it finally started to gel at one point, and then it just took off.
That's great. Another question we have is asking if you all can speak more about Civitas and the predictive modeling.
So I don't think we could do that in the few minutes we have, but there are various parts of Civitas. So it would really require some additional kind of what exactly the question is. There are various tools within Civitas, and so what we're doing with Civitas is we actually ingest their powerful predictors, and we bring these into a bigger model that we have. And so we also have ways to be able to generate who our students in different buckets are. And then we hand off those. I'm very simplifying all of this, of course, but then we hand off these lists to those who really need to have action. So our residence hall, our advisors, are the advisors themselves. So we have very specific populations who are trained to work with in confidentiality with the students who we have identified to be in different buckets that we are getting from our Civitas feeds. And then there's other tools that we can use Civitas for.
Well, and I think also there is, we found out that other universities were doing this too, that they were using Civitas, but they also had their own in-house models and different procedures that were going on. And that was good for us because we had that first, and that familiarized a lot of people with what an organization like Civitas could do for us. And it also allows us to go along and check up on what they're doing and whether it matches how we see things. And generally speaking, that's corresponded very well. But it's good to have in-house folks who can do this work if you have them. But some universities and colleges don't have people who can do logistic regressions and stuff like that. That's okay. And then you can, rely on a proprietary source. But even if you have the proprietary source and you have the capability, it seems like a good idea to kind of have both streaming along and make sure they're, if they're both going in the same direction, that's great. If they're differing, then that would be a point at which you might want to ask, well, what's going on here? What are some of the assumptions that are being made in each model, and maybe make
and just a quick note, if somebody's embarking on that, like a little bit to the point of what Charlene just said, none of these tools are just kind of turn on the switch. There's a lot of work that goes into making sure that it's applicable to your institution, that it's set up in the right way. So for example, when we onboarded Civitas, it was even making sure that our GPA bands were matching up, and so, or that courses translated the same way. So it really is very specific to your institution, and it takes a lot of making sure it's all jiving together to so that all of our output can make sense to what we're doing.
And I think speaks to all of the points that you all have discussed in terms of the different pockets and niches of collaboration, communication, hearing things and being able to be responsive and proactive in some of these areas as well. Well, I think we are about out of time, and I do have a couple more things that we do need to close out our conversation, but I do really want to thank both of you for your time today. I think it really has provided folks a lot of information. I think the scaffolding of levels and ways in which we can look at retention was really beneficial. The ways in which we can consider how institutions think of this data, provide this data, and how we can collaborate with different folks on campus. I think it really brought up some great conversation and questions, and hopefully some, questions for folks to think through. What are our governance structures? What are our strategies? How can I kind of go back to my units and think about what this means and what action we can take from it. So I really appreciate your time. I know you all condensed a lot of information. I think it's great that you all have your contact information on here. And just so some logistics of this conversation is, we did record it. It will be posted on our YouTube channel, and we will link to, in the comments of that YouTube video, or into the description, we'll link the PowerPoint that you all provided and the rubric that you also discussed, so folks can access that as well.
Thank you for having us.
Yes, thank you.
It was a pleasure.
So as we conclude, we just want to thank you all for presenting, as well as our SAL Professional Development Committee and all of their work to help coordinate and bring the conversation today. And we do want to let you know that we will be having one more structured conversation this year. And we are really excited and enthusiastic to think about, as we're closing out this year, not fiscal year, but calendar year, what are we doing as student affairs leaders to provide professional development opportunities for all of our student affairs professionals in relation to the ACPA and NASPA competencies of assessment and evaluation and research? And so we have a panel of folks across the country who do a variety of work in this development, and so we hope that you can join us for that structured conversation, and we will be sending out that information in the next week or so, where you can learn more about that conversation. So again, thank you, Charlene and Valeria, and thank you to Thomas for his work on this project, and we hope that everyone has a wonderful day.
Thank you. You as well.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.